Stuart Roberts of,
David.
it's Sprada. Did I pronounce that right? Sprada?
Yes, you did. Sprada.
Okay, again, that is your company of now, although I've known you for many years, many trips to Singapore and Hong Kong. Some trips, maybe I don't want to remember, trips down Boat Quay with you and Nimish. Maybe I should pass those to one side. It's a very different social scene out there in Singapore to Horsted Canes in West Sussex, where I am at the moment. But Stuart, I'm so pleased you're on the podcast. Just to let you know and let the audience know, I'll put your LinkedIn profile in the description. I'll also put the Sprada website in the description. So I do want you to introduce yourself, but don't spend too long on that because, frankly, people can read that in the description below. So let's kick us off,
Absolutely.
Who is Stuart Roberts? What have you been up to in all these years in market data? And what's this Sprada entity that you've created?
Okay, so I've worked on the bank technology side for pretty much the last 30 years. I've worked for a number of sort of global and regional institutions, including the likes of Citi, DBS Bank in Singapore. And about 2 years ago, I decided to set up my own market and reference data focused consultancy. I do consulting for both buy side, sell side. I also do some for the vendor side on their market data strategy. And I'm also doing some sort of fractional market data management, which I'm targeting at sort of smaller buy side organizations that don't have an in-house team. Based in Singapore, but looking after the whole Asia-Pac region.
And we're going to try, if we get time, we're going to talk a bit about Asia-Pac. But there's so much to talk about. I suspect, like with all these conversations I have, if we stick within the hour, we will run out. But that's a good thing. That's a good thing. So, and I got to know you. I think I knew you when you were at DBS, Development Bank of Singapore. I don't think I knew you in your Citi days. Was Citi in Singapore or was that somewhere else? Where was that?
No, Citi was in Australia, but I think we did meet in Hong Kong at the old APAC a couple of times.
That was where I first met you.
That's where you would have first met me, but then I think when I moved to Singapore and took over DBS, set up a market data team there, I think that's where we kind of got to know each other.
Yeah, it was indeed. Fond memories. Fond memories. I've split the conversation I think we're going to have into two main chunks, three if we add the APAC. The first one is sort of market data commercials. And then the second one I want to segue into is the market data technology. So let's start with market data commercials. I mean, it's a massive topic out there, but I want your views. Now, the sort of big issues that I'm seeing are, number one, the sheer complexity and confusing nature of licensing, especially from some of the exchanges, all the sort of non-display, redistribution, derived data. I mean, it's getting more and more complicated to manage. And there are lots of exchanges and they're all doing it differently. That seems to be a problem facing people on the customer side of the equation. And something you mentioned in the preamble before we came online was cost containment, cost control, which is something I've talked about a lot on some of my other podcast episodes. The fact that there just seems to be this constant desire from senior management to cut market data costs. And I don't know how long that can go on for. I don't know how healthy that is. I don't know what the consequences of that are and how you do it, how you keep doing it. An observation I've made, I don't understand the maths of all these user firms supposedly cutting their costs, and yet all the vendors announcing growth. I don't see how those two marry up. Anyway, look, I've hit you. Launch into it.
Yeah, on that point, I mean, I did a survey of sort of consumer firms across APAC earlier this year, and when I asked them about sort of 2024 to 2025 spend, almost 40% are saying they're expecting a 6 to 10% increase in their market data spend this year.
But is that an inflationary? Is that because a lot of the vendors do a cost of living increase, and that's in just bog standard inflation, as contrasted against buying new services?
Well, interestingly, when I sort of the follow-up question to that was sort of what's going to drive that increase in spend. When I look at it, so nearly 50% is either increasing consumption of existing data sets or buying new data sets. About 25% for each of those. There's about 30% which is marked as vendor price increase, but still, nearly 50% of firms said that increase in their spend this year is going to be buying more data from an existing data set or in buying brand new data sets they're not currently spending money on. And I think that's where the cost containment thing is. It's a never-ending challenge if you're a market data manager, particularly at a bank, because you've always got senior management kind of with their foot on your neck going, save me money out of my market data spend. It's one of my biggest costs for the trading room. But at the same time, the business is constantly wanting new services and more data. And trying to balance those two things and still achieve a save it's
not easy.
It's almost impossible. It's an impossible challenge.
They need new good consultants to come in and help them sort it out. That's what they really need. I've heard Sprada's very good, but it is. I don't understand how this can sort of carry on, because I grew up in market data in the heyday of the 80s and maybe some of the 90s. Everything was just growing. People were spending money, like getting budgets. Well, I wouldn't say it was easy, but people were just. I was a telerate salesman. I'd be sitting on the end of the phone, and people would be phoning me up and saying, I need to order 30 more terminals. I say, well, I've just got to go to lunch. I'll call you back after lunch, because it was just, we were literally taking orders on the phone. I mean, those days are long, long gone.
No, and I think there was a paradigm shift after the GFC.
Yeah.
And suddenly market data became a very much an in the crosshairs cost for senior management. And I think, I was a market data manager back at Citi then in Australia, looking after Australia, New Zealand. And I kind of felt that, this will last a couple of years and the focus will go off us a little bit, but it never did. It stayed in that crosshairs as being seen as a significant, top 3 cost for a capital markets business. And it's something that, senior management is constantly going, we need to see savings here. But the challenge is you save money on one area and then the business goes and buys a brand new source of data from another trading desk and you end up netting that cost save out.
Well, you just said something interesting there. Everything you say is interesting, but that was particularly interesting in the sense you said the business goes and, gets something, because I've watched and I've lived it, because when I was a salesman and I was dealing with, the market data teams, I would also, as a salesman, you also wanted to go directly to the business, directly to the actual users of the data. And if you could persuade the users of the data to tell these nasty market data people to just, get off their backsides and sign the contract with me. But of course, the market data team were really keen that you didn't go on the floor and talk to the business, because
absolutely.
I mean, that was always an interesting tension point. Is that still the case? Do you still see that? Did you see that in your latter days at DBS? How does that work these days?
Definitely market data teams and market data managers are definitely trying to prevent vendors from walking around the trade floor. And, I think the days of, Bloomberg salespeople walking around handing out Bloomberg agreements to traders, they're long gone. Now there are specific people who have authority to sign contracts with certain vendors, and there's a lot more process around it than it used to be. I remember back in, when I first started in the industry, Reuters PLC people, Bloomberg people, they would walk around the trade floor, they'd have a contract in their briefcase, and a trader would sign up for a new Bloomberg and someone would start paying the bill for it. For the most part, certainly with the banks, that's very much centralized now, and you would never see that kind of thing happen. But they still talk to the traders and they still, upsell their services. And then you get the traders coming to the market data team saying, I need this, or I want this additional service, or I want this additional data set. And it comes down to those market data teams to then to do some kind of QA as to, do you really need this? What's the value in that? And that becomes difficult to measure, because the trader's saying, well, I can, if I have this additional data, I can make this additional revenue.
I guess if they say that and they write that in blood and they get their head of desk to say that, it's not for a market data person to say, no, you can't have that. So, because you, as a market data person, you can't make that judgment call, but you've got to force them to commit. When those sort of situations arise, is there a methodology in place to say, okay, we've done that, we'll review it in a year, and you have to sort of somehow prove the ROI that you achieved? Does that happen? Again, I have a sneaking feeling there's a power imbalance between the front office business people and the market data teams. The market data teams are not as powerful, not as senior. I don't know if I'm getting my words right. Do you know what I mean?
No, there is definitely a power imbalance. And the market data team would generally, in my experience, you tend to have to justify your cost to like the COO of that business. So like the Treasury and Markets Chief Operating Officer. And he's the guy coming to you saying, I need you to save me some money on this cost, because he's the guy looking at the budget for that business. And that's where you kind of have to put it back. So you then go back to him with the cost, desk by desk, trader by trader. And it's then up to him to go and talk to those desk heads and go, look, why is desk A spending twice as much in market data as desk B, but their revenue is the same? Because, as a market data head, you don't get to see those revenue numbers either. You don't know which desk is making more money or less money. You question everything as, when additional services are being ordered. But at the end of the day, if the business says buy it, you buy it.
Yeah, because I guess there could be a desk or a person who is a star and just doing the most incredible business and profitability. And maybe nobody quite knows how or why. But frankly, if that person wants something, they've sort of earned the right to not be challenged and just to have it. And as a counterpoint, again, I did an episode that I hope people will have watched with Sally Hines recently. She used to be global head market data at HSBC, and she's a consultancy like you based out of London. And she was telling stories about procurement. And again, this is an interesting trend. Pure procurement versus market data specialist. Now, pure procurement, the joke is sort of, they can buy pencils, they can buy real estate, they can buy generic stuff. They're very good at doing that. I mean, procurement is a fine art, and they've tuned that art to perfection. But when procurement people try to apply those skills to market data, it sometimes falls down. And the case that Sally mentioned, I've heard this a million times, is I'm going to come in and save money. I know what I'll do. Let's cut 50% of all the Bloombergs. That's easy. Look at this spreadsheet. Look what I've saved you. And trying to take Bloombergs out of the cold, dead hands of end users is, it's not an easy thing, I believe.
It's the hardest thing to take away from someone as a Bloomberg terminal.
And you've got to applaud Bloomberg that they've done that. I mean, it's not their fault. I mean, they've done a darn good job.
No, I mean, Mike Bloomberg built a very good and very sticky product. And, all applause to him. But taking one of those away from someone is always a very difficult challenge. And you need to do that. You really need usage data. You really need something to justify it, to show the user or the user's desk head that this Bloomberg is really not being utilized for what it's meant to be used for. Now, my experience is I generally think about 25% of Bloomberg users don't need one at all, and could use something much cheaper, like a FactSet or a basic wealth workstation. And there is probably 25% who are serious Bloomberg users who get the full value of the product, or they're getting significant order flow via that terminal, which justifies its existence. The other 50%, it's a bit grey. Some of them need a premium terminal, but don't necessarily need it to be Bloomberg. Some of them do.
So where in your last few years, when big cuts have needed to be applied, where have you seen successful cost-cutting projects, and what's the nature of them? How have people managed to, is there any great advice, or is it actually a multitude of different ideas? I mean, is there a simple solution that can be applied?
Unfortunately not. I don't think there's a simple one-size-fits-all solution. I mean, in my experience, some of the bigger ones that I've achieved in my past have been more on the data feed side or the delivery infrastructure. End of day and reference data is another good place that you can go to that you can generally find some savings. Terminal, I think Terminal Terminal used to be the go-to place. You'd go and try and swap a Bloomberg for an icon or an icon for a Bloomberg and have like a displacement deal with the vendor that gave you a save for 2 years or something. But, I think Terminals it's the largest amount of work for probably the lowest return.
But also, I mean, terminals were, in my day, I started Telerate 1984. Terminals were everything. But even then, I remember Telerate had the standard output protocol, their data feed. And then there was the RDCF, the Reuters Dynamic. I can't even remember what it was, but it was a page-based data feed. These were and they just started coming out. But now data feeds are everywhere. I would say a larger proportion of the ingestion and use of data comes via some sort of data feed, not going to a human being sitting in front of a screen, but in some sort of application that's going on in the background. And therein lay a lot of the angst that was out there when things like non-display first came into being. And even things like redistribution, derived data, a lot of that I think was driven by the increase in data feed delivery of market data. I mean, talk us through that a bit. Expand on my little description.
No, it's definitely the case that terminals are not so much the focus now. It's definitely data feed is the bigger portion of the industry, I believe, and that's growing continuously. And I think the data providers and the exchanges are adjusting their commercial policies to keep up with the technology. So when algo engines first started appearing and exchanges started releasing non-display policies, and then they started adjusting those. You might have a different non-display policy if it's data's going into a risk or position keeping system versus a trading engine. Then across all the exchanges there's different units of count as well. Some exchanges count by physical servers, some by virtual machines, some by number of applications. And that's where the consumer side, it's a real challenge to keep up with all the different policies and understanding this exchange I have to count this way, this exchange I have to count this way. And some of my clients, that's been a real challenge for them without an in-house market data team, is actually understanding how these different units of count apply and making sure they're compliant, because the risk of not being compliant is a significant financial penalty from an exchange.
I mean, how are people in user firms, especially I think you've carved out a little bit of business in the smaller end, where they might struggle to have the human capacity to the staffing capacity. I nearly said manpower, and I stopped myself from saying that. The human capacity. But there's a lot of tools out there. I suppose it all started on the back of a cigarette packet. That was the favorite, keep all your information on the back of a cigarette packet. Then spreadsheets came, and spreadsheets seem to be the solution. But now I hear people saying, oh gosh, they're still using a spreadsheet. And it's almost an insult to say you're still using a spreadsheet. But a lot of people are still using spreadsheets.
Definitely. There's a lot of firms still using spreadsheets.
But I mean, what are the different things? You've got inventory management, which is, the TRG screens and the Caleros and others. That's a big genre. You've got sort of usage capacity. I mean, I don't know. There's a number of new developments there under the umbrella of tools and services. What are you seeing? What are the different array of tools and services that can be applied if you're working as a bank or a buy-side institution? You were saying earlier on that you're doing more sort of on the buy-side. Well, maybe that's a segue into a question to you. Is it different when you're at the buy side?
It is different, because what I'm seeing with the clients that I'm working with in the buy side is the focus isn't so much on saving cost, it's extracting the value out of the data. And their appetite for data is big. And they're looking at all kinds of data, and not just the traditional market and reference data that, you and I started in this industry dealing with. They're looking at all kinds of alternative data sets now. There's a firm I'm working with at the moment who's looking for data that impacts the Chinese commodity futures market. So they're looking at, data that would impact the futures price of, say, iron ore. They're looking at satellite data of iron ore smelting plants and, heat signatures to determine how much iron ore is being smelted. They're looking at, shipping data of how much iron ore is being shipped around the world at the moment, and trying to determine how that's going to affect the future price of those iron ore futures. And this kind of alt data sets are something that is very different to the traditional market and reference data, but at the same time, there are some similarities there. And it's not quite the same, the commercials aren't the same, but it is now becoming more and more part of the industry, an accepted part of our industry.
It's funny you said it. I remember, I think it was at WIFIC in Vancouver, which is 2019, there was a panel on alternative data, and somebody said, well, what's the future of alternative data? And one person on the panel just said, well, stop using the word alternative. It's data.
It's data.
I mean, maybe it's tangential data or something. I don't know. I mean, alternative implies it must be an alternative to something else. And I think that sort of core market data, which is pricing data about the price of instruments, and reference data about the instruments and whatever, is the core. But what you're describing with this alternative data is people are desperate for signals, don't they? I mean, that's what the market is trying to do with active management as opposed to passive management. They're trying to beat the market. They're trying to say, well, if I can find a signal that tell me that's going to go up, I'll buy some, or if it's going to go down, I'll sell some. But does a lot of this alternative data, do firms put that into traditional inventory management systems? Do more traditional inventory management systems lend themselves to alternative data?
I don't know whether they do yet, but I think that's something they will definitely have to do in the future. I think, the traditional inventory management systems have been very much built around the core market data vendors, Bloomberg, LSEG, FactSet, etc. But I think, they're going to have to be an ability to track these alternative data sets. But what I am seeing on particularly the smaller buy side is a lot of them aren't using an inventory system. They are still using spreadsheets. And that would be my single biggest recommendation to any client that I consult with, looking at how they manage their market data, is you need an inventory system. Using a spreadsheet to manage all of this doesn't make sense in 2025. It didn't make sense in 2020.
And what's their justification for doing that? Is it, they're just too expensive and we can cope with it? Is it cost? They just can't afford an inventory management system?
I think it's a combination of cost. I think it's a lack of knowledge. I think, and these inventory systems require a certain amount of understanding of market data as a commodity to operate them as well. It's all well and good to give MDM or optimized spend to someone and say, here you go, I put all your market data into it. But unless they actually understand the data itself, the data about the market data, they're not going to be able to extract value out of it.
Sort of rubbish in, rubbish out. If your data entry is bad, poor, or incorrect in some way, you won't get good answers out of the system.
One of your other podcasts, there was a conversation about like taxonomy and I've seen the same thing in my career. I mean, I think when I looked at one of my previous employers and looked at sort of the GL data on the market data spend, there was like 20 different iterations of Bloomberg in the GL data. So when it came to working out how much the firm spent on Bloomberg, you had to go and clean all that data up first, because otherwise you weren't getting the correct answer. I mean,
this seems to be a problem that propagates so many different elements of the industry. It's almost the naming conventions. I mean, a word that gets bandied around a lot, especially in the work that I did and continue to do with FISD, is standardization. We need standardization, because if everything was standardized, the world would be simple and easy and what have you. But we haven't managed, the industry, haven't managed to achieve that. And I think Debbie Lawrence on one of my podcasts was saying, well, yeah, it's probably unrealistic to pursue full standardization. But if we can have common language, and maybe to that point, in the inventory management story, really, really drumming home that when you say Bloomberg, just write BLOOMBERG. Don't do BBG, don't do it. There is only one way that Bloomberg should be written in our firm. But is that the answer? I mean, or is that an answer?
I think it's an answer. I think, it comes down to the individual firm to a degree when they input the data, or when they import the data from the spreadsheet into the inventory tool. There's got to be some cleanup and some standardization that happens there. Otherwise, if the base data going in is not standardized and cleansed, the output data is never going to be any good. The reports you produce won't be any good, and your tracking won't be any good. I think when it comes to standardization, I remember attending some sort of, consumer working groups with FISD more than a decade ago, talking about standardizing exchange contracts. And I think realistically, we all realize that's something that's never going to happen.
And because the customers, sorry, Stuart, go on.
I think part of that is, the exchanges are all different. They all have different commercial goals to some degree. They're in different countries, particularly in this region where the geographic spread and, different regulators in different countries, and, they're all working in a different kind of, what's the word for it?
It is. And I've talked to exchanges about this, and the exchanges, I think they recognize the angst, the problems that the customer firms have. They're not doing it maliciously. They're not sitting rubbing their hands together saying, how can we make it more difficult for our customers? They're not doing that.
I think they're working on their own basis, and it would be an enormous exercise for all of them to get together and go, well, let's come up with a standard non-display agreement for the industry. Yeah. And what do they get out of doing that? Probably not. There's not a lot
they get hemmed in. I think that's what I've heard. Is like, look, if we agree to standardize, that reduces our flexibility, our ability.
Correct.
One morning to have this clever idea. Let's do this. Oh, we can't do that because we've agreed we're going to stick to this standardized approach. So I think that is why they've never agreed to it. I think common language, common descriptions should not be a constraint. I think David Anderson's view of the world is you can have like 90% standardization of language or something. Somebody could say, but we agree that the standard for calling everything is Bloomberg spelt out, with a capital BLOOMBERG. Let's all agree that. But we got this system over here that can only take 3 letters. So we've got to put BBG for that. It's almost like a documented variation on the standard. So I think you could almost have a standard, and as long as if anybody varied from the standard, if they documented that they had varied from the standard, that gives you wiggle room. Again, I don't know how practical that could be. But on this licensing, we talked about inventory management, and we mentioned taxonomy, which is where I know Calero and Expand being a benchmarking company, who have, by the nature of benchmarking, you have to call things the same thing. So they had to come up with a taxonomy. And then if they can meld that with what's going on in the inventory management system, and then you hear about people talking about data catalogs. That's become a sort of hottish topic of late. And then another topic, which I'd love to hear your point of view on, it is the digitization of contracts. And perhaps more subtly than that, the digitization of the rights within rights management within those. So DRM, digital rights management, which is extracting from a contract in a digital format, in a computer readable format, what the rights and obligations and restrictions are within a given contract, so that a person like your good self at a user firm can better automate their compliance. So I've thrown a lot at you. Thoughts on all of that?
I mean, I think there's sort of, three pieces there. There's the inventory management. There is the rights and obligations that come with the data that you're buying. And then there's the usage of that data. And if you can tie, and if by digitizing those rights and obligations of that data feed or that data source, you can then automate that in the entitlement system that basically prevents, by having those digitized, would actually prevent you from using data in a way that you weren't permitted to. That would save a lot of headaches. And I know there are people out there working on some of this stuff. I believe Alan Ross is doing something in the digital rights management space for
DDRM, I think he calls it, DDRM. But
I think that would definitely be a positive for the industry, that if we can get to a point where we can digitize those usage rights and apply those in real time to an entitlement system, whether that be
DAX or EMRS.
That would prevent some audit failures and prevent some of the issues that consumer firms see when it comes to their market data usage.
Well, I think I remember when I first got involved with a DRM discussion, it was way back at the beginning of 2019. And it was something happening in London that both Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan were sort of leading with, and they were working with Refinitiv as well. So there was a little group of about 3 of them working on it. But I remember the folks at Goldman's and JP Morgan, the way they described the problem they were trying to solve is, if you're a market data team and you've got all these business users out there, you're getting a continuous flood of queries from the business users saying, am I allowed to do this with my Bloomberg data? Am I allowed to do this with my Deutsche Börse data? Can I do this or that? And the market data team would have to sort of look at the contracts, think about it, double check, and then give the person an answer who then decide, okay, I'll have the data. And Goldman's and JP Morgan at the time, and I think many firms, wanted to somehow automate that so that the business user could sort of type in their query into a system that would sort of say yes, no, and by the way, here's a paragraph, here's the description in the contract that tells you what your rights and obligations and restrictions are. But I don't think we're there yet.
I don't think we're there yet, but I also think this might be a use case for generative AI within the market data space as well, where you have an AI agent with a market data commercial specific trained LLM that can answer those questions for you. And I'm sure there are people out there working on something like that.
I think there are. I've heard.
Maybe I've given some people some ideas to develop.
I think that's already happening. And I think back in 2019, generative AI was not around at all. So I think there was a particularly difficult task in digitizing the terms from a contract. But I think AI enables that significantly. But again, we're still not there. I mean, it's a good thing because it gives.
We're not there, and I also think when we talk about smart contracts and putting market data contracts on a blockchain, it comes back to that. If we can't standardize contracts across exchanges, then you end up with, say, one exchange has a blockchain for all their contracts and it's standardized and smart for them, but you end up with multiple different smart contracts for different market data providers. I don't see us getting to a point where you have like one central blockchain with every market data contract for every exchange in the globe on it. I don't think we're ever going to get to that point.
But clever people are working on these things, so I'm hopeful that we're going to see some solutions. Just wrapping up this first section before we go on to the technology discussion, I'd love to hear a bit more about your fractional market data sort of idea. I rather like that idea. Just spill it out a bit more in a bit more detail, what you mean by that.
Okay, so I'm marketing this to sort of buy-side firms in APAC, specifically at the moment, sort of Australia, Hong Kong and Singapore. Generally buy-side organizations with a smaller market data spend. So we're sort of looking at sort of $5 million a year or less in market reference data. That doesn't justify having an in-house team. So you've got someone in finance paying a Bloomberg bill. You've got someone in procurement signing a Bloomberg contract. You've got someone in technology, doing some connectivity, but no one looking at it holistically and working out, there's three things I sort of look at here. Are you using what you're paying for? Are you paying for what you're using? Do you have anything that you're not using or is underutilized? Are you compliant with all your agreements? And then I provide a dashboard that they can log in and check each month. And I help them with things like, contract renegotiation, a little bit of sort of, benchmarking based from my industry knowledge on what they're paying for different things, and just kind of hold their hand through that market data process and look at it holistically for them, because they can't, if you're spending 5 million or less a year in market data, you're probably not justifying having a full service market data team in-house.
Yeah, so it's outsourcing. It's a sort of managed service, or
So it's market data as a service.
Yeah.
And I know there are other people doing it. I know, TRG does some of this, particularly in sort of North America and EMEA. But I didn't see anyone in particular like focused on this in APAC. And I thought there's an opportunity here. And I've picked up a couple of clients that I'm working with at the moment, helping them sort of get this set up.
I'm sure we broadcast this now, so about 10 other consultancies are now going to come charging in and crash the market. So I think it's a good idea. If it's a good idea, multiple people are going to do it. And again, you're an eminently experienced and capable gentleman. So I'm sure you've got your sales pitch finely tuned. So I wish you all the best on that. Let's segue. 36 minutes in, looking at the clock. We haven't talked about everything to do with commercials and data, but the other side of the coin, that frankly is where I spent a lot of my career. I was a Triarch salesman, and then I was working in marketing at Reuters on RMDS and things like that. And I watched that whole market data engineering, market data technology, market data systems world evolve over some time. And I think we're at an interesting stage. I've had already published, Bill Beers from BCC Group did one of my podcasts. Terry Roche has already done one of my podcasts. I've actually got, and maybe when people see this one with you, I will have already published Matt Eddy from LSEG. So and then I've also just recorded an episode with Bernard Shute from BIQH, BIC. So there's the big player, which I think is LSEG, with what was Triarch, RMDS, PEP, RTDS, real-time data system, or distribution. I can't remember if it's data or distribution. The RTDS is the current one. Obviously, another big player is Bloomberg, but I don't think Bloomberg are in the same space. Again, maybe
Not exactly, no.
Yeah, I do think that LSEG, Thomson Reuters, Refinitiv, Reuters, all that have been, I don't want to use the word dominant because that has a legal meaning, but they have led the way and have got a pretty sizable chunk of the market. And they know a lot about what they're talking about. But then more recently, as per BCC Group, Markets.io, BIC, Architect, and a few other companies, there are disruptors out there saying, hey, that's not a good idea. Stuart, two questions. I mean, what are you seeing? What are the challenges of a modern market data system, market data? Where are we at currently in what the needs of consumer firms, etc., for a good market data system, or systems plural? And then where should they go shopping for these systems and solutions, bearing in mind that probably most of them have got an RTDS in there? That was a lot to hit you with, but
it was. I mean, definitely LSEG has the lion's share of that market, and that's because they were the first. Triarch was sort of the first open market data system, open real-time market data system out there, and has been around for a long time. It's hardened. It does what it says on the tin. It's road tested in the industry for 20 plus years. But you're right, there are these disruptors out there now, and there is an argument for decoupling your primary feed provider from your distribution provider. And that would be the argument that, Terry Roche and from Markets.io and Bill, et cetera, would make. There is some validity to that argument. But I think it comes down to individual use cases. Some of these systems, and I've tested a number of these systems over my career, and some of them they're all very good and they all do, distribute real-time market data. Some of them work better in certain use cases than other, though. And I think it depends on your goal as an organization as to which is the most appropriate solution for you. And I think the same thing goes with, there's been a lot of talk, the last few years we've talked a lot about market data in cloud, particularly at FISD events. And that's another one where it's not every use case for real-time market data in cloud works. Feeding an HFT or an algo engine, you're probably not going to put your real-time market data in cloud. But if you're feeding a retail equities platform with, mum and dad investors looking at it on their phone and trading some equities, you can put that market data feed in the platform in the cloud because latency is not a concern.
And I mean, the cloud, which has been massively important in recent years and continues to be, is arguably just another distribution mechanism. It doesn't fundamentally change the principles that all of these firms, I mean, when we talk about the cloud, when we talk about, Google and AWS and Microsoft and Oracle, they are not building market data systems. All they're doing is creating a distribution platform that market data systems can sit on and distribute through rather than being on-prem or on-premises. But so it hasn't changed the fundamental questions. And I think you put your finger on it. I remember when I was selling Triarch and RMDS and marketing it, frankly, it was a massive benefit to be the data provider and the systems provider. There were competition issues, monopoly type issues that were already, which had to be taken into account. But the fact that the company Reuters at the time understood the data and understood the distribution technology, that combination was very powerful. And I think there is logic to that. However, with power comes a challenge. It's sort of, again, another phrase I remember in Reuters world, we loved being sticky. I've asked a lot of people subsequently whether they still, if you're a vendor, you like being sticky. It means your customers can't get rid of you very easily. I mean, it's a thing you strive for. And you can make yourself sticky by being so brilliant, by, a bit like the Bloomberg thing we were talking about earlier on. They're sticky because it's so good and nobody wants to give it up and what have you. But now there's arguments coming out saying that's lock-in. That you shouldn't. Vendor independence is what you should be striving for. If you're stuck with this system and that system means you've got to get your data from this particular data provider, that's a bad idea. I'm not sure I see all those arguments. I can see some of them, but it's not a black and white simple argument.
I think to be fair to LSEG, you can put a multitude of data sources on an RTDS platform. You're not restricted to just using LSEG data. You can put other providers on, the same as you can put an LSEG data feed into a Markets.io or an Archimtech or a BIQH.
Yeah.
It's not like it's locking you in. I think one of the things that does lock people into a data feed, though, is symbology. And I think that RIC symbology from LSEG is very sticky because it embeds itself from the front office, middle office, all the way through to the back office. And to change that data feed over to a alternative data feed, whether that be an ICE or in this region, maybe a Quanthouse from Iris or something, you're going to have to change that symbology.
And you get this symbology mapping. Sort of is an abstraction layer of sorts. And again, I was talking to Bernard from BIC about this. I remember in the old days, Reuters were very strict about their rules on RIC codes in the sense, and again, I'm going to very quickly tell the story because I've already told it in one podcast. My cousin worked for Bacardi, and Bacardi had a big issue because people were going to pubs and order Bacardi and Coke and get given cheap white rum and Coke. And Bacardi said, no, if you use our brand name, it's got to be Bacardi and Coke. And in a similar vein, Reuters said, look, if it's a RIC code, somebody's actually asking for Reuters data. If they use a RIC code, they are asking for Reuters data. You can't route that request to another data provider because they've asked for Reuters data. And I think the solutions to that is to have in your central systems your own symbology running. So you're actually not asking for a RIC code. It might be that you convert that into a RIC code.
Or an open symbology, like
Figgy. Yeah. So what sort of discussions are you seeing on that symbology? What are the things you've heard more recently? What are people doing? What are the ways of navigating that?
There is some symbology mapping. There are organizations, particularly more in Europe and North America, who took advantage of the RIC license that was available for a couple of years. I think it was around 2017, 2018. But a lot of organizations in Asia weren't aware of that, so they never bought a RIC license. If they wanted to use the RIC code that's prevalent in their internal systems to take an ICE instrument, they would have to buy a license to do that. And I don't imagine that license would be particularly cheap. I know there are organisations in this region like looking at things like open figure, but it's an enormous change to take out a symbology and replace it with another one in your organisation. And I think it's one of those things that a lot of people think it would be a good thing to do, but justifying the time and effort and development costs and everything, cost of change to do that is not at a point where people are willing to actually spend that money.
And as an observation, the market is a bit, I'm being harsh, a bit lazy, a bit conservative with a small c, very risk averse. And I think there's a lot of the devil and it's like, I could make a bit of a saving. I could be a bit better off somewhere here, but I'm just going to stick with what I've got because it's too concerning to try and imagine trying to change that. And I think that's a dangerous thing. Another observation I've constantly seen in the marketplace is customers preferring to deal with the big behemoths, complaining about these big behemoths, but then sticking with them and not wanting to deal with small companies. And again, I can understand because there's a risk factor. If you're dealing with a smaller company, maybe they haven't got the same support profile or whatever. So I don't know what the solution to that is, but I think customers are their own worst enemies sometimes because they dig themselves into these corners. And I understand the logic. I'm not really criticizing them. I understand why, but it limits what they can potentially do.
I think the other thing we've got now is that market data teams have become a little bit more siloed than they used to be. I know when I started in market data, a long time ago, your market data team did everything, handled the commercial, handled the compliance, handled the technical, did the engineering. And it now seems to be more that they've split. In a lot of organizations, a lot of the banks, the commercial side of market data actually rolls into procurement.
Yeah.
They have a market data commercial team sitting under the procurement organization, and you've got a technical team sitting under a technology organization. And so you've got people coming into market data, either technical or procurement, but not necessarily understanding both sides of the coin. And it is the same coin. I think, I was lucky that I came through at a period where I had the opportunity to learn both. So I was building Triarch platforms at the same time as dealing with an exchange auditor and doing vendor renegotiation. So I got to do both and understand how they relate to each other. I think, unfortunately now, it seems to be more that people are either commercial or technical and not necessarily fully understanding the other side of the fence.
I think that is very true. And I'll do a bit of a sales plug for myself. I'm out there doing my FISD, FIA training. And again, I think it's really important, exactly to your point, that the more commercial people need to understand some of the technology issues and components. And similarly, the technology people need to understand the commercials and what have you. And you're absolutely right. A lot of it is siloed, and that's troubling. But organizational things evolve like this, and they don't, they're unforeseen sort of consequences to what might seem a sensible organizational structure.
Yeah,
I'm conscious of time. Briefly, because we've literally got 10 minutes left. APAC. I'll hit you with a thought of my observation. Because I've travelled a lot down to your region. I enjoyed it, but I've always sensed that people in the region, you folks from London, you New York, you just don't understand what it's like down here. And I think you must have heard this a million times. And one of the simple things just to kick off with is APAC. Trips off the tongue, one region. But it's a multitude of, gosh, how many different countries, all with different languages, different cultures, religions, and business practices, and all 7-hour flights between them all. It's a complicated region to deal with. For people listening who are in North America or Europe and are thinking of doing business in APAC, any sort of words of wisdom, advice?
Look, APAC is a very complicated region, and you're right, because it is a large number of different countries with different cultures, different political systems, different regulators. It's not, probably get myself in trouble here. Like you say, compare North America or the USA and Canada, they're quite similar in many ways in culture and.
Yes, we should be careful with that one.
Be careful with that. You might want to cut this. Whereas, Singapore and Hong Kong, similar in some ways, but very different countries, and they're probably the two biggest markets.
Well, I suppose.
And then Australia is completely different again.
But Singapore, Hong Kong, and Australia were a bit Anglo, obviously because of the old British Empire stuff. There was a bit of Japan is just completely different.
In fact, a lot of banks treat Japan as a separate region to its own because it is so different to the rest of APAC. And then you take something like India is completely different again. So I think, my advice, if you want to do business in this region, you've got to put people on the ground. You've got to come out here. And I think in this region, there is a lot more value in face-to-face. People like to meet in person. They like to shake your hand. They like to do the business card. That gets you a lot more traction than trying to do Teams meetings and trying to do everything remotely.
It's expensive. I mean, it's expensive coming out there. It's expensive then being out there. And I got the sense that a lot of companies, they start out in their home country, build in their home region, and then maybe obviously New York would be, if you're a European sort of entity, then New York is the natural place to go. If you start out in New York, then London's the natural second place to go to. APAC is further down the list because it's complicated and expensive to do it. But again, it always was. I've lost track a little bit. I mean, it was always growing faster than North America.
But at the same time, if you look at the Burton Taylor report from last year,
right,
APAC's market data spend is outgrowing EMEA and North America, or the Americas.
So in terms of pure growth, that's enormous. But what about, a few years ago, China was everything. Again, we're in a slightly political conversation, but in terms of just not politics, but markets, everybody was looking at China as this enormous market opportunity that they were all going to cash in on. And that never really happened. But also China, in our world, if you're selling electric cars or iPhones, China's manufacturing. But China isn't really producing market data, is it? And there were a couple of market data vendors, but there's a lot talking about selling into China with market data and then market data coming out of China. Any observations?
Well, there's certainly market data coming out of China, and China has quite a few exchanges, and they've got some particularly like commodity futures exchanges. And I've got a client who's trading in that space at the moment. But China can be a little bit trickier to deal with, and some of their vendors, and there are restrictions on specific market data they can sell outside of China. Some market data you can buy from vendors you can only use within China, for example. And so I think China's a little bit more challenging to deal with, unique. And I think to do business in China, it helps to have Chinese language. I personally don't, and I think that would always make it a challenge for me to do much in the China market.
Yeah, interesting one to watch. Anyway, look, I promised I would give you, at the end, a sort of final couple of things that you wanted to say if we missed anything. Was it something you didn't get to say that you think the market data world out there needs to hear? Final thoughts from Stuart Roberts.
Look, I think in the next couple of years, we're going to see a continuation of the growth of what we call alt data, which is really sort of data which has an underlying effect on the traditional pricing data. And I think we've had AI in the financial markets for decades now, but I think generative AI is going to have an impact, and I think it's going to have an impact probably more around the tooling that we use to manage market data than the actual data itself. Although I do see a future where we'll be able to generate a lot of the sort of back testing data from AI, maybe scenario based, where you'll be able to ask an AI to give you a year's worth of equity data with a particular scenario that happens during that year, and it will create a set of market data that you can back test on using AI with particular scenarios of some kind of world event, whether that be a war or some kind of natural catastrophe that would impact markets. And I think you'd be able to generate huge numbers of scenarios using AI to generate this synthetic market data to then do back testing on.
I agree. I think we've only just scratched the surface on AI. I'm intrigued about agentic AI, the agents. Again, generative AI, my interpretation was you could sort of ask questions and get information, but then agentic AI was where you could then get it to do something as a result of that. So I think I'm very excited about it. So look, Stuart, thank you for doing this. I will be seeing you
pleasure, David.
Singapore at AsiaFIC. If anybody sees this before AsiaFIC, Stuart and I will be at the FISD AsiaFIC event at the end of May the 28th, 30th, I think it is, Thursday and Friday mainly, talking about market data in Asia Pacific. So there you go. Stuart, thank you so much. I am now going to hang up. Don't go away though.